Have you wondered if you were rightly taught? Were you encouraged to pursue what to think or how to think? Join us today while we discuss these questions in search of the truth. My name is Tim.
And my name is Bryce.
And welcome to the Townsmen. We're glad you're here. All right, Bryce, what do we got, brother?
Yeah, the title for this episode is The Methodology of Education. I know we hear a lot about education. What is it? What is it for? So a lot of avenues we can go through. But I think it'd be good to start with the methodology or the procedure of education. So I'll start with my experience in particular at AP Biology. This is back in 2011. In good old days when the iPhone was still relatively new and everyone had still the iPod video and the iPod Touch.
Yep.
So there I was sitting in class, and the professor, I'm trying to remember what his name is, but he was a very good professor. He might still be around. So he was teaching us biology and the topic of evolution came up. And the textbook, of course, did a good job describing what evolution was. And it was kind of ironic in that it gave a little blurb, I think, in a bit talking about, well, there are other differences and that some people maybe think it's, I don't think it says creation, but there's like intelligent design or something like that too. But that was just a little blurb. But it basically said, here's evolution, here's what it is, and it's just fact. You have to trust it. And for the rest of the class, we went to this website. Forget what the website is called, but talking about and teaching us what evolution was. And it gives you a scenario of, here is this dodo bird millions of years ago. And fast forward thousands of years, and it was adapting and whatnot. All of a sudden, a new predator comes out, and it gave you a prompt that said, oh, here is this new predator. What characteristics or what traits would be beneficial for this dodo bird to have in order to survive? And it would make you choose. And then based on your choice, it would, oh no, the dodo bird doesn't exist anymore, it does. And it would give you a few scenarios. Oh no, there's an ice age. Or oh no, there's an earthquake or something like that. And in that time, again, growing up in public school, it's like, yeah, evolution is true. You shouldn't really question it. I thought to myself, so let me get this straight. In order to explain evolution, we go to this program that was created by smart people who understood this principle, so to speak, and that I, being a sentient being, chooses based on a scenario what this creature should have in order to survive. And I kind of thought to myself for a second, this seems more like intelligent design than evolution. Well, I think through divine providence, later that night on the Science Channel, there was an experiment that was set. And they said, here is how we explain evolution. And what it did is it started off with a perfectly straight line on a piece of paper. And they would go around the different population and they'd say, trace this line for me. So somebody would trace this line, and then they would take the copy of the traced line, and they said, hey, trace this line. And what eventually it did is it deteriorated to the point where it was just kind of this jumbled, jagged line.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, again, this wasn't, I wasn't reading the Bible. I wasn't, exploring different views and opinions of evolution. I just kind of thought to myself, that doesn't really explain evolution, in that what evolution claims is simplicity to complexity.
Mm-hmm.
But really what that proved is perfection to degeneration into nothing, which that sounds more like corruption and a sinful nature and what would happen. And so it just kind of got me pondering a little bit. And that was in the beginning where we talked about this. Like, have you ever wondered if you were rightly taught? What were you taught? I think in our current culture and society, we're seeing a growing split of, well, education and public education is just this terrible thing and whatnot, or yeah, we need to continue down public education, where these teachers are the best thing ever. And it just seems like there's this big split. And my hope for this episode is to explain maybe a methodology and to start off at somewhat of a principled level of what education is.
Mm-hmm.
And so in good Townsman fashion, the definition, and the best definition that I found was from Aristotle. Education is the process of training men to fulfill his aim by exercising all faculties to the fullest extent as a member of society. And I think that captures education quite well. It is a process or method of training people to exercise all of their faculties. This is why we had VII. This is why we have mathematics. This is why we had art class. All these different faculties that we have to exercise them to the fullest extent to be a member of society, to be a productive member of society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the ideal of education and what it should do.
Yeah.
So to kind of pivot then a little bit, that's the ideal of education in terms of the method. What we hear a lot is education indoctrination. And so indoctrination by definition is here is a set of beliefs that are, for all intents and purposes, undeniably true. Is education indoctrination? I would say at its core, yes, in that in order to have a methodology to teach, what are you teaching? And are you teaching sound principles? Again, principles or laws, these are things that really we need to learn them, and they're just undeniably true. Now, to understand them, that's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But we teach, for instance, the law of gravity. We teach the law of gravity in engineering school. We learned about the law of gravity, the formula and all that. And it's a law. You cannot get around gravity. Now, how we understand gravity, that's a different story. Like, why do two masses attract to one another? What is the factors at play? That's where we'll talk a little bit later about at the different levels of higher education and understanding it. But at its foundational principle, yeah, you need to believe in gravity, or believe that 2 + 2 = 4. You know, there needs to be a foundational, and it's an indoctrination into this thing. Where even we see this now, where 2 + 2 = 4, mathematics is racist. I'm like, what principle are you talking about there, man? Like, race has nothing to do with math. But again, it's an indoctrination into a view that, well, everything is based off of race and whatnot there. So this is where I would say, yes, education is indoctrination, that there is an inherent presupposition that what is being taught is undeniably true. Again, going back to my AP biology, well, yeah, evolution is true. You can't question it. It's there. You read it and you learn it, and that's it. Indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or a group to accept a certain set of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with education, indoctrination is inherently built into the method or into the curriculum.
Okay.
But what do you think of that?
I think so, and you have to be careful of what your doctrine is.
Mm-hmm.
I think far too often it can get pretty muddy pretty quick. Nowadays, with our world understanding as it is, it tends to be a little bit more reductionist, scientific. What are some theories we can not necessarily prove but are provable? I think those are the things we're often taught. Mm-hmm. So, like with evolution, and I would agree with you that the models they presented were crap.
Yeah. There are probably better ones out there.
There certainly are. There must be. But I would also add to that, too, that just because some things we learned in high school and I learned some of the similar things, I look at it in a similar way to how I look at what I learned in church as a kid. Is it completely insufficient for the rest of your life? Absolutely. Is it sufficient enough for the time being? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, yes. It kind of gives you an introduction so you have a basis of understanding for what those things are, even if ultimately they don't hold up well. And you got to understand, too, evolution and really anything you learn in school is vastly more complicated than you'll ever be able to really dig into with the time allotted. But I'd say a lot of things are easily dismantled if you have a shallow understanding of them because that's what you're offered. But I don't think that necessarily means they're true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to be clear, that is not me fighting you on that of like evolution is false. I could have my own opinions on that, but just as claimed, as it was presented, a poor understanding of something is really easy to turn away from. Like, that was my beliefs as a kid when I was going to church and stuff like that. It's like, well, this is crap. It doesn't work. It's like, it's not supposed to work after a certain amount of understanding, life experience, or growing up. Is it just enough to get you through this thing and then you kind of figure it out on your own eventually? Do I think that's the best way to do it? Not necessarily, but I understand it, I guess.
Yeah. No, I like that. It was, not speaking on your behalf, but we kind of have a similar upbringing of, here is a wide smattering of kind of foundational stuff. Ultimately, we want to get you to be a self-taught learner and to kind of continue carrying the football forward.
Yeah.
Which talk about in those pursuits, but I agree with you to the extent. And I guess what I was getting at is, well, are we allowed and should we question those foundational principles, even for in church and religion too, of, if somebody makes the claim that there is a God, well, let's examine that claim and see, does it have the best explanation? And education should give you skills and tools in how to question those things.
Yeah.
If you want. Some people are not interested, some people are. And that's where I think the higher education is. So to start then, when we look at, I would say, a classical view of education, and I say a view, as in kind of my 2 cents on the issue. A classical view of education, I think would be good to explain is the nature of children, as in their state of mind and understanding. And the 3 areas that I'd want to hit on is, 1, the sinful nature of children. Yes, this is talking about theology, and I think it's important in that sin or being sinful simply means being in a rebellious state. In that you're bent towards not following rules, you're bent towards rebelling, you're bent towards being prideful. There's this bent of, and I'll put it this way, for those who have children, you never had to teach them how to lie, cheat, or steal. They just do. And so with education, there should be a process of disciplining them, of first getting them to understand. And this is where the second idea of double ignorance comes from. When I first read it a few years ago, it fascinated me because when I look into the world, I see a passive arrogance will breed an aggressive ignorance. And it got me kind of pondering of, well, where does this ignorance come from? Double ignorance, like, oh boy, what does that mean? So double ignorance at its core simply means you don't know that you don't know anything, or that someone doesn't know that they don't know anything. And it got me thinking of, are we born in that state? Are we born in a state of we don't know that we don't know anything? So when I see children, what I see is that they don't know that they don't know anything. And the goal or the purpose of an educator is to help them understand that you're in that state, to get them into a state of ignorance. And then hopefully when you're in a state of ignorance, that's not inherently a bad thing, by the way. Arrogance, that's a different story, but ignorance, that's not. When you get to a state of ignorance, what do you do with it? Do you remain ignorant, or then now you have a humility to pursue education and to learn in a state of humility? And I just think that children, again, just my view, are kind of born in a double ignorance state. They don't know that they don't know anything. And the hope is that the educators, parents in particular, help them understand, listen, you're not as smart as you think. You don't know everything. I remember as a kid spewing off things that I thought I knew, but I had no clue what I was talking about. And unfortunately, to some detriment, my parents kind of went along with it as opposed to questioning it and helping me realize, oh, maybe I am wrong. And then finally, I used the term hedonistic. There's a variety of terms that really were just these raw balls of energy and desires and passions. And that kind of feeds off of the sinful state as well. Is it's not inherently wrong to have these desires and passions, but because we have a bent towards a sinful nature, those desires and those passions generally get exercised in wrongful ways. And that's where in education there is a strong level of discipline. This is where you see the old school children are sitting down quietly, and if they speak up, they get slapped on their hands, but with the ruler or whatnot, it was a disciplining act. And what it is, and I don't agree with that to the fullest extent of, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy kind of deal. But it's more of there does need to be discipline. And what it is there should be a method to help guide those desires, those raw desires, towards good things. I think the Bible talks about that. Let the hands of a thief be used for good rather as opposed to evil. And again, with the double ignorance part, in that children, they don't know that they don't know anything. And my hope and my prayer is that we don't leave them at that state. I think that's what we're seeing in society of today of, well, I'm angry, I'm mad. Well, why are you angry or mad? I don't know, I just am. So I'm going to go throw rocks through a gas station window and steal stuff. Well, Well, why are you doing that? I don't know. I'm just angry and mad.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfortunate. And I think education, we should use a system of education to discipline them.
Mm-hmm.
No, you don't throw that through a rock. No, you don't do this. And it's not just a bunch of do's and don'ts, but here, I see you have a passion to work with your hands. Let's use that for good.
Yeah, there's a way to discipline and teach at the same time.
Yeah.
I would focus certainly on the discipline aspect, but I think just for argument's sake right now, I would focus on the teaching aspect of things, like when you touched on the sinful nature of a child. Every virtue, honorable thing, all of those things that a person can do are basically choices that people make when facing a temptation or a bad situation that would cause a person to sin.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, look, son, daughter, whomever, or if it's a student of yours, say, I know there is a temptation to cheat on your test because the grade matters, and the grade matters for this and this and this and this, and you could name 1,000 reasons if you needed to. But I think when you focus on, but the right thing to do is study hard, like your times tables when you're a kid, or your vocabulary tests, things like that. Study hard because it's the right thing to do, because the ultimate goal is not to get an A.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate goal is to learn how to be a functional member of society and hopefully a good person.
Yeah. I really like that, Tim, because that reminded me in college. So confession time. I had a final project at one of my engineering classes, and again, I don't know why, but it always seems like it happens with really good professors. This guy was a wonderful professor, probably the best professor I had at Tech.
Yep.
Also a devout Roman Catholic too. I think that helped contribute. But we had this final project where what we were doing using fluid dynamics, we were designing a sprinkler system for a golf course.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, I was just freaking out. I had a lot going on. I didn't really know how to do it. It wasn't really making sense to me. So instead of being humble and going and seeking help right away, I kind of stewed a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually I built up enough courage to go ask him for help. And he did an excellent job explaining me the principles and whatnot, and it finally clicked for me.
Mm-hmm.
But when it clicked for me, instead of being excited and said, all right, I'm going to work hard, even if I have to go all night to do it, I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a couple of the holes in the golf course correctly, and then based on the numbers that I find, I'm going to fudge the other numbers for the different holes.
Mm-hmm.
And what it looks like on paper and the set is it looks like, oh, that looks like it was done correctly. But really all I was doing was, oh, I see that there's some difference here, some difference there. I'm just going to add, subtract. Instead of putting in the work and the effort of going through every formula correctly, I just simply made up numbers.
Yeah, that's how I got from elementary through high school. I didn't read a single book cover to cover until I was 21 years old. So, yeah, I get the temptation to just pick the easy way out.
Because that epiphany happened when it was due the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Bad timing. And so I did it, and I knew it looked good, but deep down inside, it just ate me up so much to where after the class, I actually got a pretty good score on it. After the class, I went up to him and I said, hey, can I talk to you? Well, actually, I went to his office. I said, hey, can I talk to you? I go, I just want to let you know I fudged a few of the numbers to finish the project. And he was actually kind of disappointed.
Mm-hmm. Rightfully so.
Because, and this is where it kind of clicked as to what you were saying, was the goal shouldn't be to get a grade. The goal should be to understand the principle.
Yeah.
And I told him, I go, what I did is I did these couple holes correctly, and then based on the differences, and he knew exactly what I did. And he was actually kind of sad. I was like, well, why'd you do it? I go, I panicked. It finally clicked to me 24 hours before it was due. Instead of spending all night doing it, I would only spend a few hours, make up some numbers, and then just call it good.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually was just like, well, I'm glad you actually came up and did it, because there's a lot of students that probably did something similar. And he said, surprisingly, your case isn't as bad, because I've had students that have actually copied off of other students.
Oh, yeah.
Complete. And so that is just kind of something that has stuck with me to where there are still the temptations. Confession, there has been times where I have either fudged numbers or didn't do exactly what I was supposed to do. But I think that was just the Spirit convicting me of, hey, and this is where, again, it's hard to separate ethics and morality with education, with all these things here. So you bring up a very good point to where the goal of education shouldn't be just to get a grade and to get through it. It's where I see, and I remember in high school being that way too. Oh man, the only thing I really care about is I think this girl is cute, or I didn't make the A team in basketball, all the popularity contests where no, the goal should be learning and having a love for learning.
Yeah, getting to who should be responsible for educating children. What do you got there?
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little spicy. Again, caveat, this is my opinion. How I kind of view, maybe this is an overcorrection of what I see in today's society, but I think when it comes to who is responsible to educate children is the parents with the aid of the church. Now, when I say the church, I mean a religious establishment or a religious institution.
Okay.
It should be ultimately the parents with the aid of the religious institutions. And the reason why I say this is when I read in Deuteronomy 6, what it says is, teach your children in the ways of the Lord. When they get up, when they lay down in bed, when you're at the dinner table, all of these things, you are to teach your children in the way that they should go. I don't think it's in the same verse, but it says you teach them in the ways that they should go. So when they depart from you, they will not leave the faith or leave the understanding. And so for me, I take that as a principle. Some people take that as a suggestion. I take that as a principle of, well, education is ultimately the responsibility of the parents. Well, not every parent is made the same. Not every parent is either interested or has time or what have you, right? And this is where this is more adiaphora, gray area in this matter. Although the responsibility lies with the parents using different resources, fine. And I think their primary resource should be a religious institution. When I say the church, as in a body of believers or a religious institution, it's not just Christianity. As much as a conservative Christian, do I want everybody to be taught the Bible and taught about God, Jesus, the scriptures? Of course I do. But I also know that God is sovereign and God uses things in mysterious ways. And if somebody is born, let's say, in the Middle East, with a Muslim family and whatnot, and if they are taught in those ways at that religious institution, do I think they're wrong? Yes. But my goal as a Christian is not to force them to believe, but rather to present the gospel in the faithful way. And so I think it should be an aid of the religious institutions, because it goes back to, you can't separate the ethic, you can't separate morality, because if you're disciplining children to do right things, what does right mean? By what standard are you judging? And that's where I think the responsibility lies with the parents primarily, but with the aid of the church or religious institutions. Now, is there a time and a place possibly for government? Maybe. But just what I see historically is generally when the government does something that I think is outside of its responsibility, it tends to ruin things. We'll talk about it at a different time. It really is the roles of the church, the roles of government, and the roles of the family. And I really do, this is going back to old, even Augustinian view of your local church should be your primary source for religion and whatnot. Even if there is maybe a better church that's hundreds of miles away, unless you want to move there and you feel so strongly convinced that you should be taught by them, great. But stay with where you are and work with what you got.
Yep.
That's really kind of more of a reformer's view too, is I'm not here to start a revolution of completely dismantling everything. If I can, I want to reform from within. But it's definitely no less a contentious topic.
Right.
Because we hear separation of church and state, a lot of these things, and I would love to discuss further in different episodes and different contexts, but I'll leave it at that, in that because education has an indoctrination at its core, by what standard are you teaching? And that's where I think the religious institutions are primarily responsible for that, not inherently the government.
Yeah.
I say not inherently because the government also judges off of a standard as well. The religious institution says, thou shalt not murder. Well, if somebody does murder, who's responsible to judge? I think that is the government's role.
Sure.
Not the religious institution. So, sorry, crusaders and those who believe that you can hang and burn heretics at the stake. That was a medieval understanding, and I'm sorry, but I think that's wrong. But to carry on. If children are taught by parents with the aid of a church, again, not a particular denomination or even a religion, there tends to be a growth in the critical thinking, and there's a theological foundation. I just think there's more benefits to it if it's done rightly. Again, there are times where it's not done rightly, but if it's done rightly, they tend to have better skills. They have a theological view. They tend to have a more robust foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But what will happen is there will be a diversion of thought and understanding, where if the government comes into play, generally speaking, if the government teaches its population, it will most likely only develop loyalists and kind of more, I'm going to use the harsher term, slaves. All we're going to do is create servants of the state.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what we're here to do. So we're either going to create soldiers, or we're going to educate widget makers, and you're really only there to serve the state at the time.
Yep.
Where if children and the religious institution, it's more about loving neighbor and loving self.
Yep.
Or I think it's just a little bit different view. And maybe this is what we're seeing with these years and years of government education and government institution. That's kind of what we're seeing.
Thomas Sowell talks about that, and he basically says that there are educators that just create educators, and the people that are just taught to be teachers. Looking at the numbers, he says, and I haven't looked at them personally, but this is what he says, and I trust him. The people that are being taught to be teachers, and solely teachers, have the lowest mathematics scores, the lowest sciences scores, all of those very critical thinking skills, they score the lowest. And then those are the people teaching your children. And it's been going that way for a long time. And that's unfortunate.
I think you're right. And there should be a higher view of the educator. I think they should be held to a higher standard. And I'll talk about kind of the different purposes of higher education. But you're right. I think Thomas Sowell, he has data on a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of what are some of the solutions and what are some ways to really solve that. And I think it just goes back to a more classical view.
Sure.
And from a biblical standpoint, we can see this when it comes to what a government or what an authority will do if they're responsible to educate. Really, when you read in Daniel about the prophet Daniel, and right in the first chapter, in the first verse, it talks about this was at the time when the Chaldeans occupied Israel. They took the young men out of Israel to do what? To indoctrinate them in the Chaldean culture and education, right? The purpose wasn't for them to learn and to think critically. The purpose wasn't for them to maintain their heritage or whatnot. No, the purpose was to create more Chaldeans.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I like Vodi Bakum, the pastor that I really enjoy listening to. He says, if you send your children off to be taught by Caesar, don't be surprised when they come back Roman.
Mm-hmm.
I just find that kind of a funny quip there, but it does beg the question. If children are taught more locally by families and by the local congregations, there's probably going to be a diversity of thought, right? Maybe your Roman Catholic family down the road were taught more Roman Catholicism. Then you have the evangelicals on this side. Maybe there's a small group of Mormons there. So you have all these different local, diverse education. What happens when they come together for the purpose of higher education? And this is where I like the term university come from.
Mm-hmm.
University, when broken down, simply means unity in diversity.
In diversity of ideas, to be clear.
Correct.
We have bastardized that word to hell, but diversity of ideas.
Yeah, it's so sad. Where what it used to be was, here is a place for the sake of higher education, the sake of pursuing truth, to hone your skills, to learn more. You come from all these different backgrounds of thought, understanding. You come together for the sake of purpose. Now what it seems like is, well, we want diversity of different biological traits, but we want everybody to think the same.
Right.
And I truly believe that that's not what the purpose of university was for, or what it is.
Yep.
So the university then should be a place where people from diverse backgrounds, local education, they come together to unite in a pursuit of higher understanding of truth.
Mm-hmm.
So there are really kind of two fields to go with in university. And this is kind of what I've seen. In a classical liberal education, what it seemed like it's more about honing those raw skills that you were given. Logic, rhetoric, reason, even mathematics, right? Honing those skills to be a kind of a Renaissance person of more of you have these good foundational skills that you've been honed, that have been tested at university, at higher education. Or there is a room for specializing. This is where the hard sciences come in. A doctor, for instance, right? Let's say a heart surgeon. Yes, I want him to know how to read, write, and all that stuff. But more importantly, I want him to know how to do heart surgery. To kind of touch back on with parents and their responsibility, what I think is also good is there gets to be a point, this is where the university comes in a little more. It gets to be a point where they're capped out in teaching the children foundations, and maybe the child has an interest in, let's say, engineering, or interest in being a doctor, or even being a businessman or something like that. Or maybe they don't really have an interest, but they want to pursue more in education. That's good. You want to give them that launching pad and then help guide them into finding a field or a university or something reputable that they can continue honing.
Yep.
Because again, going back to Aristotle, the ultimate purpose is for them to exercise their faculties to be a member of society. As opposed to what we see in some areas, it just seems like, again, more of an indoctrination camp where you're not really taught anything that contributes. Again, university, right? The pursuit of higher education. It's either honing those skills, classical liberal arts degree, or a specializing. And so I'll talk real briefly then. This is what I've seen and what I think is kind of more of the ideal for the three-tiered approach of university. You have the bachelor's, master's, and doctorate. So the bachelor's degree, what it's meant to do is to taught you the principles of a particular field. And I know there's associates, certificates, and whatnot, but I'm just talking about the big three. So again, the bachelor's, to get you to understand the principles of the field. For instance, when I went through engineering, right, they're going to teach you laws of thermodynamics, laws of physics, all of this here, these principles that you need to know. A master's degree, you demonstrate that you have a master understanding, or that you understand these principles to the point where you're able to teach them, or that you have a good grasp on these principles. Most teachers, even professors, they need to have a master's degree. And I think that's rightfully so. You need to have a master's of what you're teaching. You need to understand what you're teaching there. So, and then the doctorate. This is the big one where you put the DR in front of your name, or the PhD. The doctorate then is that you can demonstrate the ability, having mastery of these skills, to discover something new, to be able to do experiments or to discover something new in a particular field, and then be able to endure careful examination of your findings. That's why it's kind of the big one. Not a lot of people get it, because you have this mastery of these skills. Now you're using these skills to discover something new, and then you're able to endure critiques from those who have also gone through a similar thing. And I think you have a good kind of summation.
Yeah, and I think when you brought up ignorance, this is basically the official way of getting out of ignorance. You need to understand that you don't know anything. You go into like a bachelor's program, you kind of learn what there is and some good idea of what those things are, and you kind of pick your field, if you will, to get into your master's, and you master that field. And then after you've mastered it, now you can kind of look back and question it and move things forward. So there is the understanding the territory, being in control of the territory to some degree, and then expanding the territory. I think is a reasonable way to look at it.
Yeah, and I like that, because that's what the doctorate is for. And it's that, hey, let's understand it, master it, now push it forward, continue advancing forward in it. And I think that's where the university comes into play, is that there should be these three fields, or these three tiers, if you will, of the university. So to kind of sum it all up here briefly, and this is just a little taste in this broader topic of education.
We'll touch on it again, I'm sure. I've got a lot of books on a lot of different ideas about it, so I think we'll definitely hit on a couple other specifics on education in later episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll sum it up this way, is education, there is a fundamental core of indoctrination when it comes to education, so we need to be mindful of that. But how I've always seen it is this: if you have children, they're born in double ignorance. They're born in this raw, hedonistic, and a sinful bent to them. Parents, if you love your children, which I know you do, hopefully you do, you want what's best for them, and you want to gear them towards being a productive member of that society. So it's your ultimate responsibility to do that, whether you're teaching them or you're finding help elsewhere. Hopefully set them up for success, to be a launching pad So then they can pursue something that's more noble. When it comes to academia or when it comes to understanding more, that's when you send them off to hopefully a reputable university where they will build upon those foundations that you have given them. So then they can become their own productive member. And no matter what level they get at, maybe they just get to in the particular field, maybe they get that bachelor's, that's great. And they want to get right into and start using those skills that they have.
Great.
And maybe they become masters while in the field themselves. They don't need to go back to academia to demonstrate that they're a master. Maybe they're good enough there, or maybe they pursue more.
Yep.
Ultimately with the goal of, and this is why I think education is important, and we shouldn't shy away from it, and we should be speaking into that, is I think it is to help grow children into being productive members of society so they can love God and love their neighbor. You learn these skills to not just demonstrate how good you are at something, but hopefully you're using these skills for the better good. Right?
Sure.
The mechanic is helping out the person with their car, right? Hopefully that's a demonstration of love for that neighbor. So I think I enjoy talking about this.
Sure.
And can be passionate sometimes about it, because looking back at my life and seeing how I was taught, well, there's some good. Yeah. Was there some bad? Of course. And I think it's good to explore back in the methodology of education. Question it. Does it hold water? Just like what this whole project is about. Let's investigate. Let's see what's working, what isn't working, be able to tweak, and ultimately set people up for success for the greater good.
Yep. If I could sum that up a little bit, education is absolutely a necessity for everyone. Now, who does it? The primary responsibility lies on the parents and the church as we've defined it. Anything after that, so like a state school or something like that, should be supplementary. The primary things a child needs to know to function in the world should come from parents. The job of a parent is absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Anything outside of that is something that the parents can choose, that they can guide their child through, because teaching a kid to read is difficult. Teaching a child mathematics is difficult, and all of that can be expensive and time-consuming. So there is definitely benefit in supplementing and, to some degree, delegating those tasks to people who are good at it, who are professionals at it. We could discuss, and we eventually, I'm sure, will, that maybe the people that are doing it aren't doing a good enough job, but ultimately a properly functioning education system should just be supplementary and subordinate to the authority of the parents and of the church.
Yeah, ultimately the authority of the parents.
Yeah, definitely, ultimately the parents.
Yeah. This is where when you see parents going to school board meetings and whatnot and voicing their opinion, that should be heard.
Yep.
Because that's their child.
Yep.
And you think they won't do anything for their child, they're going to do everything they can for their child.
Very well, yeah.
Well, this is Bryce.
And this is Tim.
We look forward to hearing from you next time.